This is Dr. Michael Cameron. This is the Registered Behavior Technician, Module 6. The specific strand that it comes from in terms of the Registered Behavior Technician task list is C03, which is the skill acquisition area. The title of the presentation is Use Contingencies of Reinforcement, and the duration of this presentation will be 60 minutes, similar to other modules, and of course there'll be a competency-based assessment at the end of the module that consists of 5 questions. With respect to the specific goals of this module, it'll be first to explain the operation and effect of reinforcement. Next, to discuss the various categories of reinforcement. Third, to provide a technical definition and define positive reinforcement, and to provide a technical definition and to define negative reinforcement. And then finally, to provide an overview of the basic schedules of reinforcement. I'd also like to point out that similar to other modules, you will see the bullseye on certain slides, and that's an indicator to you that the information being covered on that particular slide is of relevance and importance, and to be important for you to recall that information for the purpose of the quiz and certainly for the purpose of the competency-based exam. The information in this module links nicely to the previous modules, specifically the anatomy of a skill building program and also the essentials for preparing to implement a skill building program, because this module is about reinforcement, and reinforcement is the fundamental principle and tool that we will use in order to build skills in an individual, and specifically individuals that you'll be working with as a registered behavior technician. Now, with respect to why this information matters so much, as I just mentioned, we use reinforcement for shaping behavior that already exists in a person's repertoire, but also building new behaviors in a person's repertoire. And as I mentioned previously in prior modules, many of you here will be working in a variety of different settings. Some of you will be in public school-based settings, others in private school-based settings. Folks here will be in home-based settings, working for families directly in a child's home or an adolescent's home or even an adult's home. Some of you will work in hospital-based settings and also clinics as well. But regardless of where you are, your responsibility will be to build skills and to develop competencies in individuals that will have an improvement in their quality of life as a result of your hard work. So what kind of skills? Well, communication skills, language skills, social behavior, play skills, literacy skills, academic skills in general. And for those of you that may be working in a rehabilitation setting, for example, working with a veteran that may have a traumatic brain injury, or working with individuals who have had strokes, for example, in the context of a rehabilitation hospital, you may be working on things like ambulation skills. And these are all skills that require development, and it is through the use of reinforcement that we're able to affect change and increase desired behavior. And I just wanted to point out what some of those desired behaviors are. But it will depend on who you're working with and in what context you're working with them, what will be your focus. Now, with respect to history, because I'm a firm believer that anybody going through this kind of training in the field of behavior analysis, whether you be a registered behavior technician or a board certified behavior analyst, it's always important, in my opinion, to link things back to the historical roots. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and provide a bit of an overview. A lot of the work that we'll be discussing today, the principle of reinforcement, actually comes from the early work of Edward Thorndike. He was a person famous in the field of psychology, learning psychology specifically, for his work in learning theory that essentially led to the development of the field of operant conditioning. He essentially studied learning as a result of consequences. In order to do that, his subjects happened to be cats. And for those here going through the registered behavior technician training that is a cat lover, or you own a cat or many cats, you know that they are quite inquisitive, quite exploratory, and they essentially give you lots of behavior to work with. perhaps too much at times. But Thorndike created what he referred to as the puzzle box, and you're seeing that here on the screen. And essentially what he did was he created this box where he would put a cat, and on the outside of the box he would have a bit of fish that was out of the reach of the paw of the cat. And the cat's responsibility, the cat's challenge in the context of this puzzle box was to figure out how to get out of it. And there were moving levers that if pressed or pulled would release that door that you're seeing on the screen. And then of course that would allow egress and allow for the cat to access the fish on the outside of the box. So Thorndike essentially studied the behavioral repertoire of cats in the context of the box, and he also timed the duration it would take for a cat once in the box to figure out how to exit the box. And he plotted those learning curves. And also what he found was that those particular behaviors that ended up having a desirable payoff, specifically the opening of the door, and then the ultimate payoff, of course, being access to the fish. Those behaviors that resulted in those payoffs ended up being strengthened, and they would also increase in frequency. And then also the speed of the execution of those behaviors would get more and more rapid as the cat had repeated exposure to the puzzle box. And Thorndike called this the law of effect. And he published this information sometime, between the years of 1898 and 1905 is when he was doing his experimentation. Now, following that, we have the work of B.F. Skinner, of course. And Skinner, being the wise scientist that he was, looked at his predecessors, and he looked at the work that they did and the findings that emerged as a result of their experimentation, and he built upon it. And Skinner was interested in the work of Thorndike as well as others, Watson included, and he began looking at the role of consequences in behavior change as well. And his particular interest was in the field of what he referred to as operant conditioning. And it was coined that way because it's based on how organisms operate on their environment, thus the term operant conditioning. And he wanted to look at how future behavior was determined and impacted by the consequences that were delivered. And when he found consequences that impacted and strengthened behavior and increased behavior and frequency, he referred to this as reinforcement. So we move from the law of effect, thank you, Edward Thorndike, to reinforcement, the principle of reinforcement. Thank you, B.F. Skinner. And of course, it is that experimentation that set the stage for us today as clinicians, whether you be a registered behavior technician or whether you be a board certified behavior analyst. We have benefited from those findings and that information because our interest is in the applied field and the applied world, and it really required that experimentation with animals, specifically with cats, or for Skinner it was with rats and also pigeons. It required that experimentation to discover the principles that we benefit from. Because today, you and I use these principles, reinforcement, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, as well as other basic principles. We use these principles for the purpose of impacting individuals' lives, making socially significant and meaningful changes in individuals' lives as a result of the groundbreaking work done by Thorndike, Watson, and B.F. Skinner. So that's a little bit of history for you. And again, I always think it's important to trace everything back to its roots, so you have a good appreciation of our field and where the concepts come from. Now, one of the things I want to make very clear is that although we'll be talking about how these principles can be applied to benefit individuals, whether that person be on the autism spectrum, or whether that person have a psychiatric disturbance, or whether that person have a traumatic brain injury, or perhaps you're working in behavioral gerontology, surely you will apply these principles there. However, these principles are alive and well in our own lives. And I really encourage you as a registered behavior technician candidate to begin looking for things that function as reinforcers in your life to begin identifying positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers, because it's through that identification of things going on in your own life that results in the stickiness and the understanding of these concepts. By way of example, for me, on a routine basis, I will go to a car wash. I'll get in my car, I'll drive the 6 miles, I'll go to Glendale, California, and there's one particular car wash that I go to every time, and I'll get my car cleaned. The reason for that is because that behavior, getting in my car, driving the 5 or 6 miles, paying the money to go through the car wash, ends up in a consequence and an outcome that that accelerates and strengthens my behavior, and that is a clean car. However, there's also something interesting about this particular car wash that I go to in Glendale, and this ticket right here comes directly from my wallet. You can see the phrase on the side of it. And it works like this. Every time I go to the car wash and I pay my fee for it to be cleaned, the person that is at the cash register will initial in one of these boxes. And the plan, of course, is that once I get to my 10th trip to the car wash, I get that one free. So not only am I being reinforced when I go to the car wash as a result of getting a clean car inside and out, but they also got me on a schedule of reinforcement. And schedules of reinforcement is something that we will talk about a little bit later in this particular module. Now, one of the things that I want to spend some time on is what's referred to as categories of reinforcement, because those things that strengthen our behavior can fall into a variety of different categories. And I'm going to name 8 of these categories for you. And I'm also going to give you a mnemonic device to remember all of these categories. And I'll give you a quick preview right away. But the mnemonic device is gut TV as visual. I just want you to recall that a little bit later. I also want to point out that all the information I'm about to give you comes from a very good article published in the late 1980s by Mason, McGee, Farmer Dugan, and Tom Risley, and this was published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So all the information I'm about to review with you has been published and discussed in the flagship journal for us, and that's the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So regarding the categories, the first category that certainly affects behavior and can strengthen behavior is what's referred to as gustatory reinforcers. That is, those things that we can eat, those things that we can drink, and those things can be very strong and powerful in terms of reinforcers. Now, one of the things that I want to point out to you, because within the first 5 modules, we spent a lot of time talking about the ethics of your work. Whenever you're selecting a gustatory reinforcer, it is always a good idea to check in with the stakeholders, specifically the mom or dad or grandmother or grandfather whose home you're working in, or if you happen to be in a public school, checking in with the teacher, because there can be very strong opinions and preferences with respect to the use of gustatory reinforcers. I should also point out, from a cultural sensitivity standpoint and from a religious standpoint, there may be clear preferences on part of the family in terms of what you do and do not use in terms of foods as reinforcers. So there'll be things specifically that need to be avoided or things that specifically need to be included. And then also from a dietary standpoint, there are clear preferences in terms of an individual's diet. Perhaps this is an individual that has allergies, food allergies, and there are things that need to be avoided. So ask the question as your best policy. Make sure that you're checking in with the stakeholders, the mom, the dad, the grandmother, the grandfather, the teacher that happens to be in the classroom in which you're working with an individual. That is a very good practice to get into and absolutely necessary. But there's our first category, gustatory reinforcers. The second category is what's referred to as olfactory reinforcers, your sense of smell. Your sense of smell is powerful. There are many things in our lives that function as reinforcers that take the form of smells in our lives. So, for example, if you have a grandmother or a grandfather and they have a particular scent, just their scent alone can be powerfully reinforcing to you, especially for those people in this room going through these modules that have had experiences where your grandmother or grandfather have passed away, and you come in contact at a later date with their clothing, perhaps in a closet, perhaps in a cedar chest. You open that cedar chest, you open that closet, and you smell their smell, and that's powerfully reinforcing to an individual. So it exists in our lives, and the sense of smell can be a reinforcer for an individual. For those of you that have ever picked up a child and that child has immediately put their nose in your hair or next to your neck, for example, smelling your perfume or your cologne or your shampoo or the conditioner in your hair, that's an individual that may be powerfully reinforced by the sense of smell. I like to point out as well that there's children's markers that are used. The scent markers, you've seen them. You take the cap off and there's a scent of cherry or a scent of strawberry or a scent of grape or peach. Those are designed like that for a reason, and that's because markers that have a smell are powerfully reinforcing to some individuals. Not everyone, but certainly some individuals. That's why I'm going through all these categories, and that is so you can be creative in terms of what you do with an individual, and not just trying to stay with one kind of reinforcer in one particular category. So far we've got gustatory reinforcers, we got olfactory reinforcers. Another category is what's referred to as thermal reinforcers. So heat or coolness or coldness can be very reinforcing. Anybody here that routinely purchases drinks and you get that cup filled with crushed ice, for example, and you spend time chewing that ice or holding that ice in your mouth, you may be a person that is reinforced by the thermal sensory consequences that you're receiving, or taking a really hot shower on a very cold day. Can be a thermal reinforcer, or a hot bath, for example. And then in contrast, taking a very cool or a cold shower on a very, very hot day. I know in Los Angeles in July and August, it can get extremely hot, and a cool shower and a cold shower sometimes is exactly the thermal reinforcer that many people seek out here in this city. The next category is what's referred to as tactile reinforcers. So these are reinforcers that are appealing to the sense of touch and sensation on the skin. So a child, for example, putting their fingers on clay, or not even a child, an adult putting their hands on clay, perhaps on a potter's wheel, for example, and holding that clay or molding that clay in some way can be a powerful tactile reinforcer. A child putting their hands in a bin of beads or beans, for example, can be powerfully reinforcing to the individual. So the sense of touch and the tactile stimulation can function as reinforcers for an individual. The next category is what's referred to as vestibular reinforcement. So anybody that has a child or has worked with a child, for example, and you've tossed that child up in the air, you've spun them around, or perhaps you have a sit and spin, and you put them on the sit and spin, and you allow them to zoom around in circles, or even putting them on an office chair in doing that, or a kid on a zip line, for example, or a rocking horse. All those things are vestibular reinforcers and can be very powerful to individuals. They also lend themselves nicely to what we refer to as activity reinforcers. So you can provide that vestibular stimulation through some activity, and the entire activity coupled with the vestibular sensations that the person's receiving ends up being a very strong reinforcer for an individual. The next category is what's referred to as auditory stimulation and auditory reinforcement. For us, it may be music that's played, or it could be a person's voice that can be an auditory reinforcer for us. I recall working with one young girl. She's about 9 years old, and I worked with her. She was at Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts. And one of the things that we were trying to established with her was a good independent bedtime routine. That's a behavior we're trying to strengthen. We were looking to get her to brush her teeth independently, to wash her face and hands, put her pajamas on, get into bed. And the independence specifically is what we were trying to increase and strengthen in this little girl. Now, this little girl was from Greece, and her grandma and granddad were in Greece. And one of the things that she absolutely adored was listening to her grandmother's voice, specifically listening to her grandmother read her books. Now, because the grandmother and granddad were in Greece and she was in Massachusetts, one of the things that we did was to get the grandmother to do audio recordings of her reading books to her granddaughter, and we would get new supply of that just about every 3 weeks or so, and we would use that as a reinforcer. So after she independently went through the process of getting ready for bed, brushing her teeth, washing her hands, washing her face, putting her pajamas on, getting into bed, we would give her access to her audio recorder, and she was able to play the audio recordings of her grandmother reading to her, and it was a powerful reinforcer for her, and ended up being exactly what was needed because we did develop her independence in those particular areas. The next category is what's referred to as social reinforcers. So we are social individuals, social creatures for sure, and many of us really enjoy spending time with friends, spending time with family members, even meeting new people. So social opportunity can function as a reinforcer for a person as well. And then finally, there's a category referred to as visual reinforcers, and in that category would fall things that provide visual stimulation to us. It could be a television, it could be a video game, for example. It could be a kaleidoscope, it could be looking through a prism. There's any number of things that function as visual reinforcers. For me, I really like riding on trains, and one really neat visual reinforcer for me is when I'm in an eastbound train and we're passing a westbound train, and you look into the windows of that westbound train and all you can see is a blur of faces and colors are popping, and the images are blurred and fast moving, and that's a pretty powerful visual reinforcer for me. And I really like that kind of stimulation, and enjoy it when I have an opportunity to experience it. So those are the 8 categories, and I just want to remind you of the mnemonic device that I created for you. Got TV as visual. So the G in the mnemonic device is for gustatory stimulation, gustatory consequences. You can arrange them. Once again, have the sensitivity in terms of checking with others before doing so, but gustatory consequences can be quite effective. The next category, the O in the gut, is for olfactory. So you can arrange smells and the person to have access to smells following a desired behavior in order to strengthen that behavior. That can function as a reinforcer. And then the T in gut would be for thermal, and things function as reinforcers that fall into the thermal category. Next, for the T and TV, we got tactile reinforcers, and of course the V is for the vestibular reinforcers that are potentially existing for an individual. And then the A and the S is for auditory and social, and then the visual, as it is visual stimulation. So these are the 8 categories, and once again, comes from an excellent article, Practical Strategy for Ongoing Reinforcer Assessment, by Mason, McGee, Farmer Dugan, and Todd Risley. And if you ever have the opportunity to read that article, I would highly recommend that you do so. Now, the implication of this information is that you should have regular discussions with individuals that you're working with and working for about what the potential reinforcers are for a person, and talk to your board-certified behavior analyst about what may be functioning from these various categories as reinforcers for a person. Now, in order to identify specifically what may be working as a preference or what may be functioning as a reinforcer for a person, we do conduct actual assessments. And one is what's referred to as a preference assessment, and the other one is referred to as a reinforcer assessment. The preference assessment is designed to discover the possibilities in terms of what could function as a reinforcer. The reinforcer assessment is to verify that something actually does accelerate and increase behavior. And one of the things you'll learn very quickly in a few slides is that we do not call something a reinforcer until it has actually demonstrated the capacity to increase and strengthen behavior. By the way, another great volume and a resource for you on the book binder on the left-hand side right here of the screen is Applied Behavior Analysis by Cooper, Heron, and Heward. This is a volume that you'll certainly make access to and have access to if you end up pursuing your education, which I hope you do, and you become a board-certified behavior analyst. Now, with respect to the formal definitions, you've got a bullseye here, so you know that this information is of particular importance. The term reinforcement, and we use that term when it occurs when a stimulus change immediately follows a response and increases the future frequency of that type of behavior under similar circumstances. Now, that word increases in red, and it's in red for a reason, because we cannot call something a reinforcer unless it actually has an impact on behavior. So although we may arrange for some consequence for a person, we may even consider something to be a reward. If it does not increase behavior, then we do not call it a reinforcer. It may be something the person willingly takes. It may be something that, if it's a gustatory stimulus, they may gladly eat. If it's a tactile stimulus, they may gladly engage with and touch, for example. But unless it increases behavior, we do not call it a reinforcer. It may be a reward, but the terms are not interchangeable. A reinforcer can only be called such when it increases behavior. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that reinforcement can increase the frequency of behavior. So let's say we're working with an individual and we're trying to get greeting skills in place. We want the person to greet others when they come in contact with them. It's a social thing to do. It's a friendly thing to do, and we're looking to strengthen that particular behavior. And perhaps the reinforcer that we've arranged for the individual is working for us, and as a result, we impact the behavior significantly. We go from a baseline of some pretty low rates of greetings to post-intervention, where we're seeing some robust frequencies of greeting behavior. That would be one way of identifying a reinforcer, in that we increase the actual frequency of a behavior. However, there are other ways of impacting a behavior, and that can be through the duration that the behavior occurs. So we can identify a reinforcer as a result of prolonging and getting longer and longer durations. So let's zoom over to a hospital setting. We're working with an individual. Let's say it's a geriatric patient, and perhaps that person has had some cardiac event, and they're regaining their skills in terms of their walking, and perhaps they're using a walker, and perhaps we're arranging consequences for that person to walk for longer and longer periods of time. First maybe just 15 seconds, and then maybe 30 seconds, and then up to a minute, and up to 3 minutes. And then finally we got the person walking down the length of an entire hallway, and that's taking a good 8 to 10 minutes in duration. So through the use of reinforcement, we can actually increase the duration of a behavior. So that's different from the frequency, because we're just getting more and more of a behavior, the same behavior, the walking, but we're getting it to occur longer and longer periods of time. So that's another way that we can identify a reinforcer, not only the frequency, as I mentioned, but also the duration. But there's more as well. We can actually impact the latency of a behavior. So let's take a child that is learning how to read, and perhaps they're developing phonemic awareness, and they're looking at letters, for example, and producing the letter sounds. And we're, through reinforcement and through good feedback to that individual, we are getting shorter and shorter latencies, meaning the person is doing it faster and faster and faster, right to fluency. And that can be a measure of a reinforcer as well. So we've impacted the latency on the behavior. So reinforcement can impact frequency. It can impact duration. It can impact latency of behavior as well. But now there's even more. Reinforcement can also impact the magnitude of a response or the force of a response. So let's go back to a veteran. And perhaps that veteran has had some kind of injury to their arm, for example, or their hand as a result of combat. And perhaps that person is learning to reactivate or re-engage with things in their community that they need to do regularly. For example, turning on a gas pump at a gas station. You know as well as I do that for those that require some manual movement with your hands, then putting on that pump can require a certain level of force in terms of pushing the lever. And you can only be effective so long as the magnitude of that response is sufficient. So one way of demonstrating that something's reinforcing is by us increasing and adjusting the magnitude. So perhaps initially the person did not use enough force, but through this process of reinforcing the person's greater and greater magnitude of response, the consequences are forthcoming. So we can impact magnitude as well. And then finally, we can also impact topography of responding. Topography simply means the form of responding. So there's a lot of behavior analysts, for example, that are interested in athletic performance. They're interested in football and competitive swimming, competitive dance as well. So topography plays a large role, especially if you're a dancer. You know, you think of something like Irish step dance, or you think of ballroom dancing, and the form of your responding has to be a particular way. So it's through reinforcement of that individual for the correct topography, the correct form of where they're putting their foot, where their foot's landing, how they're holding their body, how they're holding their torso. It is through reinforcement that we can affect change in topography of responding as well. So when you think of reinforcement, you know, always think you're increasing behavior, but also not only the frequency, but you could be impacting the duration, or you can be impacting the latency, or you can be impacting the magnitude, or you could be impacting the topography of a response. So reinforcement's a pretty cool thing because we can get a lot of different behavior as a result of using it. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that we reinforce behavior. We do not reinforce people. We are reinforcing specific forms of behavior. That's what we're looking to increase. And I just make that point known because in our observation and in our verification that something's a reinforcer, it's a behavior that we need to count or to measure in some way, if it's a duration or a latency, for example. It's only through that measurement and through that verification that we can actually say that we've identified a reinforcer and we have a reinforcer on our hands. So that's why we get very specific with our language and stress the fact that we're reinforcing behavior and not people. And I know I said this before, but it's worth repeating. A reward is not necessarily a reinforcer. Somebody may gladly take something, gladly eat something, gladly touch something if it's something tactile, gladly look at something or listen to something, but unless it increases the frequency of behavior or the duration of behavior or the latency or magnitude or topography, we will not call it a reinforcer. Now, a couple of classifications that are important. The reinforcers that you use along with your board-certified behavior analyst will fall into a few different categories. The first category is what's referred to as primary reinforcers. Those things that are not, those things are those stimuli that do not require any learning or teaching on your part to function as reinforcers. So food items and hydration fall into that category. Anybody that's here going through the registered behavior technician modules that has a newborn, for example, you know you don't have to teach that child, that newborn, to desire food, to want food, or to be impacted by food, or for food to function as a reinforcer in some way, or hydration to function as a reinforcer. We refer to those kinds of reinforcers as primary reinforcers or unlearned reinforcers. Other people have referred to them as biological or innate reinforcers, things that require no learning whatsoever. The second category is what's referred to as secondary reinforcers, or these are things that need to be learned. So for example, for you to be impacted by praise requires learning. It requires you learning the language. If I were to praise you in Armenian, for example, then it wouldn't necessarily mean anything to you the first couple of times, unless you learned what those specific words meant. And then through that learning history and through my use of the Armenian language, you would be perhaps reinforced by my praise. Another category would be sounds. There's certainly sounds in your environment that that could function as reinforcers. One such sound would come from video games. I think I'll just take an example that may be common to many people here, and that'd be Mario Brothers, because it's dated and it's age. So there are varying age levels of people going through this registered behavior technician module. So I'm just going to use Mario Brothers as a great example. So the Mario Brothers sound could be a powerful reinforcer to you. And of course, that is what's referred to as a stage change sound. And that could be something that perhaps you come in contact with and is very reinforcing to you. So that has to be learned, and that's why we refer to it as a secondary reinforcer. You're not born listening to sounds like that and being reinforced by it. It is something that you learn as a result of using video games, playing video games of your preference. Okay, so primary reinforcers, unlearned. Secondary reinforcers, these are learned. We'll use both of them in our work with individuals. And then finally, the third category, it is what's referred to as generalized conditioned reinforcers. These are reinforcers that are associated with many, many things. So, for example, if you have a Visa card or a MasterCard or an Amex card, and you present that card, there's any number of things that you can get as a result. You can purchase food with it. You can purchase recreational activities with it. Perhaps you like F1 go-kart racing, and you go to the go-kart racing track and you pay with your Visa card. Perhaps you like going to concerts or to plays or to the movie theater. So you can take that card, that Visa card, that MasterCard, that Amex card, and you can exchange it for any number of things. And that's what makes it a generalized conditioned reinforcer. It's something that has to be learned, so that's why it's conditioned. Generalized because it can be exchanged for many, many things, and it has its great impact and takes on great value as a result of its capacity. Now, one of the things I want to remind you about is that I mentioned that there is a specific process that we go through to identify what functions as a reinforcer for an individual. And that will be the topic for the subsequent module, by the way. We'll be talking a lot about preference assessments. And the preference assessment allows us to use a systemized, methodical approach to make a determination as to what could potentially work as a reinforcer for an individual. Whether or not it's a reinforcer will have to be tried and will have to be verified as a result of an increase in behavior, but it's our way of gathering information in terms of what could potentially function as a reinforcer. Now, a reinforcer assessment is a validation assessment. We're actually demonstrating empirically that, yes, we're increasing behavior, the frequency or the duration, or we're impacting the latency or the magnitude or the topography of behavior as a result of the consequences that we're using. And once again, I know I said this already, but it's worthy of repeating. Mind your ethics. And I cannot stress enough the importance of cultural sensitivity and your awareness that the stakeholders who may be the guardian of the individual who you're providing services to, they have very strong opinions about what you're using as a reinforcer. So ask the question, get permission, make sure that you're reviewing your plan in terms of the delivery of things that hopefully are reinforcers for you. Reviewing that plan with your BCBA, reviewing the plan with the stakeholders. It could be a teacher, it could be a nurse in a hospital, it could be a physical therapist or a speech and language pathologist in a clinic-based setting, maybe a mom or dad. Or a grandmother or grandfather in a home. And then, of course, I'm going to remind you of this because we covered this information in a prior module as well. You're always avoiding harmful reinforcers. So from a gustatory standpoint, you know as well as I do that there are foods, for example, that may be high sugar content, high salt content, high fat content, and then in great volume, those things could be harmful to the individual. Or even something like video games. I just played Mario Brothers for you, but there are some children, for example, that will essentially isolate themselves or sequester themselves and become very non-social as a result of free access to technology and video games, whether they be on handheld devices or otherwise. So you're always avoiding the harmful reinforcers as well. Just a reminder there for you. Now, with respect to the definition of positive reinforcement, it occurs when a behavior is followed immediately by the presentation of a stimulus that increases the future frequency of that behavior under similar conditions. So a positive reinforcer is it's a stimulus whose presentation or onset functions as a reinforcer. Okay, so I just did this drawing for you. Not me personally, I had a friend do it for me. But the language skill would be a person requesting or demanding something or requesting something, ready for blast off, maybe the statement. So that's a behavior. We want more of it. For some reason, we want that person making these kinds of requests and communicating in a way using their vocal verbal behavior. So as a result of that, what we'll present, and you get that plus sign. See that plus sign on the battery there? We're presenting this charge to the individual, and that charge goes right to the rocket ship, and the rocket ship blasts off. And those are the consequences. So as a result of saying ready for blast off is a presentation of the charge and a presentation of that rocket ship blasting off, and that increases the future likelihood of the behavior. What behavior? Saying ready for blast off under those conditions, sitting in a rocket ship and having somebody available to present the charge and to have that rocket ship zoom off for you. That would be a positive reinforcer. So from an operation standpoint, the operation is the presentation of a stimulus. What am I presenting here? The charge and the zoom off rocket ship. And what effect does it have on behavior? It increases behavior. What behavior did it increase here? Language skills, saying ready for blast off under these circumstances. So as a result of the operation, that is the presentation of something, and as a result of the effect, the increase in the likelihood of using language, ready for blast off, in the future. As a result of that, we've identified a positive reinforcer, and we have used the principle of positive reinforcement. And that is something that you will use frequently in your own work. Now, that can be compared and contrasted to what's referred to as negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement occurs when a behavior is followed immediately by removal or termination or reduction or even the postponement of a stimulus that increases the frequency of a behavior under similar conditions. So a negative reinforcer is a stimulus whose termination, reduction, or postponement functions as a reinforcement. And that can be conditioned or unconditioned. Okay, let me give you an example here. So I'm flying an airplane, Cessna 172 airplane, and perhaps I don't have my headset on while I'm flying that airplane. And the noise in that airplane cabin is unbearable. It's loud, perhaps it's a windy day, perhaps the wind is just rattling the side of the airplane and whirling around in the context of the cabin. So under that condition, I turn to my co-pilot and I say, pass me my noise canceling headset. And the co-pilot passes me the noise canceling headset, and I put the headset on, and suddenly what happens is that there's a termination of all the noise. So the only thing I can hear at that point are other pilots talking or somebody from the tower speaking to me. So that is what's referred to as a negative reinforcer. So what happened? Well, there's an operation and effect. What's the operation? Something was removed. What was removed? Something unpleasant. Under this set of circumstances, what was unpleasant was that loud noise in the cabin of the 172 Cessna. So as a result of that, a particular behavior of mine increased. What behavior? Well, under those conditions, when they occur again in the future, I'm going to turn to my co-pilot yet again and ask for the noise-canceling Bose headset. And then I will summarily put that headset on. Why do I want to do that? Because I want to terminate the noise that is very uncomfortable to me. That is a negative reinforcer. One of the things I should note, of a special note, is that negative reinforcement is not punishment. They are different principles, and I want to make sure that you never confuse the two. So a negative reinforcer has its impact as a result of the termination, reduction, or postponement of something that may be unpleasant or uncomfortable to us, and that will increase a behavior. In the case of this example, the behavior of me asking for a headset when I came in contact with what was uncomfortable for me. We'll be reviewing more about negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement in other modules as well. Now, with respect to the classification of reinforcement, there's two other distinctions that I want to make. The first classification is what's referred to as socially mediated reinforcement. That is reinforcement that has to be delivered by another person. It's mediated by another person. It's arranged and organized by another person. So you remember at the beginning of the module I told you I really like to go to car washes. So if I'm in another state, for example, I'm not in Glendale or in Eagle Rock, California now. I'm in Florida. I'm in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I want to get to a car wash. I don't know why I would do that because I would have a rental car at the time. But maybe I wanted to go to the car wash just because it's so darn reinforcing to me. And I see a pedestrian on the side of the road, and I pull over to the side of the road, and I ask that person for directions to the car wash. And that person gives me the directions, and then I go. So those directions, that would be a secondary reinforcer, right? Because it's something that had to be learned and it'd be conditioned, so it falls into that category. So I get to the car wash and I come in contact with the consequences that I like, and that's a clean automobile. However, it did require and it did take communication from another person. So for that reason, we refer to it as socially mediated reinforcement. Now that can be considered separately from what's referred to as automatic reinforcement. And automatic reinforcement does not require another person to organize it for us. So for example, if I take a spoonful of pomegranate seeds and I eat those pomegranate seeds and they explode with flavor in my mouth, and they're wonderful and they're ripe and they taste just fantastic. It doesn't require anybody to organize that consequence for me, or that stimulus or the reinforcing consequence for me. It's automatic in nature. I bite down into them, and I come in contact with the juice of the pomegranate and the flavor of the pomegranate, and all of that is automatic. So we got two different classifications here. So when we talk about reinforcement, we can say that things are sometimes socially mediated, or at other times they are automatic in nature. Now the final thing I want to point out is has to do with what's referred to as schedules of reinforcement. When you think of schedules of reinforcement, think of the rule in which the reinforcer will be delivered. And the board certified behavior analyst that you work for, will spend a lot of time talking to you about the rule of reinforcement delivery. Whenever we have a situation on our hands where a person needs to engage in some behavior, some observable, measurable behavior, for a fixed number of times before they are receiving the reinforcer that may be arranged for them. Could be something thermal, could be something visual or auditory or gustatory. If they're required to engage in a particular behavior for a fixed number of times and then it's delivered, it's what's referred to as a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. So the BCBA supervisor that you're working with will tell you hey, after every 10th time you see that greeting response, I want you to reinforce. Or after every 5th time the person engages in some particular motor behavior, I want you to reinforce the behavior. Or after every 300 words that have been orally read aloud by the individual, I want you to reinforce the behavior of reading. Now that's different from what's referred to as a variable ratio schedule. And whenever you see the term variable, I just want you to think of variation. So for this, there would be variation in the number of responses that need to occur before the payoff comes, before the consequence is delivered, before the reinforcer is arranged and delivered to the individual. So let's go back to the greeting response. Maybe the person has to greet 3 times. Maybe the person has to greet 8 times, maybe 12 times on another occasion. So it's varied. And whenever we have varying requirements, and can all rotate around some average. Whenever there's variation in requirement of frequency, for example, we refer to that as a variable ratio. And then the other 2 basic schedules is what's referred to as fixed interval and variable interval. These are time-based schedules. And what that means from a fixed interval standpoint, that a fixed amount of time has to elapse, and then the first response after that will result in the delivery of reinforcement. Or if it's variable interval, then a varied amount of time has to elapse, and then the first response after that results in the delivery of the reinforcer. So the schedules of reinforcement is something that you'll talk to your BCBA supervisor about. This is going to play an important role in the work that you're doing, and will be a topic of discussion for you and your supervisor as well. So just by way of overview, we've got our definitions. You know what positive reinforcement is. You know what negative reinforcement is. Both are increasing behavior. It's just the operation that is different. For positive reinforcement, we're presenting something. For negative reinforcement, we're taking something away. But both have the impact of increasing a behavior that we're looking for. Negative reinforcement is non-punishment. There's separate principles. You'll be discussing punishment at a later date. So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. And then we have primary reinforcers, unlearned, right? And then secondary reinforcers. Those are all things learned. And then we got that generalized conditioned reinforcer. And there we're talking about things that can be exchanged for many, many other things, like an Amex card or a Visa card or a MasterCard. Then we've got those 8 categories. And I encourage you to be creative with the reinforcers that you're using. Look at the possibilities from a gustatory standpoint, an olfactory standpoint, a tactile standpoint, and then a thermal standpoint, vestibular standpoint, and then also auditory and social, and then visual. So get creative. And remember that if you want to go through this formal process, and you will at some point, this formal process of determining what could function as a reinforcer, you'll use what's referred to as a preference assessment. And then if you're validating something that consequence that you think is functioning as a reinforcer, you'll actually do a reinforcer assessment on the individual. And then finally, we got socially mediated and then automatic reinforcers as well. And then we have our schedules. So great review here. Now some questions. The 8 categories. Remember your mnemonic device here. Gut TV is visual. Gustatory, olfactory, tactile, thermal, vestibular, auditory, social, and visual. And what's the operation and effect of positive reinforcement? Well, you're presenting something. That's why it's called positive, because it's additive. You're presenting something. The word positive doesn't have any value statement connected with it. It just means a presentation or the addition of something to the individual. What's the operation and effect of negative reinforcement? Again, no value judgment here. It's just that something's removed. So it has a deduction. Something's taken away. Something's terminated. And that's why it has its impact and increases behavior. So both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement impact behavior. In what direction? Well, they both increase behavior. And we don't call them reinforcers until they do. So true or false? Negative reinforcement is the same as punishment or resounding false. No, that's not true. Negative reinforcement is not synonymous with punishment. And then finally, a classification of reinforcement that does not require another person to deliver. Well, then you'd be talking about automatic reinforcement. That can be compared and contrasted to what's referred to as socially mediated reinforcement. So we covered a lot here today. And I thank you for your attention. I'm really looking forward to the next module where we're talking about actual preference assessments that can be used. Take care.